March 1946, a small farming community nestled in the wheat fields of western Kansas. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Henderson farmhouse, where 7-year-old Mary Beth lay motionless in her bed, her right leg twisted at an unnatural angle, her breathing shallow and labored. Her mother, Sarah Henderson, stood by the window, clutching a handkerchief soaked with tears, watching Dr. Robert Mitchell shake his head slowly. Outside, 3 more families waited their turn, each carrying a child who could no longer walk, no longer run through the golden fields they'd played in just weeks before. The polio outbreak had descended upon rural Kansas like a silent plague, and the closest iron lung was 300 kilometers away in Wichita, a distance that might as well have been 3,000 for families without automobiles or money for fuel. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them could have imagined was that their salvation would come not from American medical institutions, but from an unexpected source, a 38-year-old Japanese woman who had spent the previous 3 years behind barbed wire, classified as an enemy of the state, and whose unconventional approach to healing would transform not only their children's lives, but challenge everything this isolated community believed about their wartime enemies. Dr. Mitchell had been practicing medicine in Barton County for 23 years, ever since returning from the First World War, with a chest full of medals and a head full of nightmares. He delivered most of these children himself, watched them take their first breaths, heard their first cries. Now he stood helpless as their small bodies succumbed to a virus he could neither see nor fight. The Henderson girl was the 11th case in 2 weeks, and he knew from his medical journals that more would follow. The pattern was always the same: fever, headache, stiffness in the neck and back, then the creeping paralysis that could leave a child unable to breathe without mechanical assistance. The telephone lines had been buzzing for days. Mitchell had called every hospital within 500 kilometers. The answer was always the same: no beds available, no iron lungs to spare, no specialists who could travel to such a remote location. The war had ended less than a year ago, but its effects lingered like smoke in the air. Medical resources were still stretched thin, focused on treating returning veterans and rebuilding the healthcare infrastructure that had been entirely dedicated to the war effort for 4 years. Sarah Henderson's voice broke through his thoughts, raw with desperation. "Doctor, there must be something. Anything." Her hands twisted the handkerchief into knots. "I can't just watch her suffer." Mitchell removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that had become habit over the past 2 weeks. "Mrs. Henderson, I've exhausted every option I know. We need specialized equipment, trained nurses, therapists who understand rehabilitation. We're a farming community of 800 people. We don't have those resources." What he didn't say, what he couldn't bring himself to articulate, was that even if they had the equipment, even if they could somehow transport these children to a proper facility, the survival rates for polio were declining every year. Some children recovered, many didn't, and those who survived often faced a lifetime of disability, their legs encased in metal braces, their lungs dependent on mechanical assistance. It was Thomas Henderson, Sarah's husband, who made the suggestion that would change everything. He'd been standing in the corner, his farmer's hands clenched into fists, his face carved from the same hard prairie stone as the land he worked. "What about the Japanese woman at the Hoffman place?" The room fell silent. Dr. Mitchell turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "The internment camp worker?" "She's not in the camp anymore," Thomas said carefully, aware he was treading on dangerous ground. "Hoffman sponsored her release 6 months ago. She's been working their farm, helping with the harvest. Name's Akiko Yamada. Word is she was some kind of healer back in California before the war." Sarah's face hardened. "Tom, you can't be serious. She's Japanese, one of them. After what they did at Pearl Harbor, after everything, our daughter is suffering," Thomas interrupted, his voice steady but strained. "I don't care where help comes from, Sarah. I just care that it comes." Dr. Mitchell had heard rumors about the woman. The Hoffman family had been ostracized by half the town for sponsoring her release from the internment camp in Colorado, where over 7,000 Japanese Americans had been held since 1942. The war had ended, the camps were beginning to empty, but the hatred lingered. Enemy aliens, they'd been called. It didn't matter that most were American citizens. That many had sons fighting in Europe, with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in United States military history. "She's not a medical doctor," Mitchell said slowly, thinking it through. The Hoffmans mentioned she practiced some kind of traditional medicine, herbs, teas, massage techniques. Nothing that would be recognized by any medical board. "Can it hurt?" Thomas pressed. "Can it possibly make things worse than they already are?" The doctor looked at Mary Beth, at her shallow breathing, at the slight blue tinge developing around her lips. In his 23 years of practice, he'd learned that sometimes the best medicine was humility, the willingness to admit when conventional approaches had failed. "No," he said finally. "I suppose it can't hurt, but I want to be present when she examines the child, and the final medical decisions remain mine." That afternoon, as the March wind swept across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of earth and coming rain, Akiko Yamada arrived at the Henderson farmhouse in the back of the Hoffman's truck. She was smaller than Sarah had expected, barely reaching 5 feet tall, her black hair streaked with gray and pulled into a severe bun. She wore a simple cotton dress that had been mended multiple times, and she carried a worn canvas bag that clinked softly with glass bottles as she walked. Her eyes were what struck Sarah most forcefully, not their shape or color, but their expression. A profound sadness mixed with something harder, something that had been forged in circumstances Sarah could only imagine. This was a woman who had lost everything, who had been imprisoned by the country she'd called home, who had watched her husband succumb to pneumonia in the harsh Colorado winter because the camp's medical facilities were overwhelmed and undersupplied. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Yamada," Dr. Mitchell said formally, extending his hand. The gesture felt important somehow, a small assertion of civility in a world that had recently forgotten its meaning. Akiko took his hand briefly, her grip surprisingly strong for such a small woman. When she spoke, her English was precise, each word carefully chosen. "I make no promises, Doctor. What I know is very old, very different from your medicine. It may help. It may do nothing, but I will try." She approached Mary Beth's bedside with a quietness that seemed to fill the room. For long minutes, she simply observed. The child's breathing pattern, the color of her skin, the way her muscles had begun to atrophy, the slight tremor in her left hand. Then, with movements so gentle they were almost invisible, she began to examine Mary Beth's legs, her fingers tracing the muscles, applying pressure at specific points, watching for responses. "The paralysis is not complete," she said finally, speaking directly to Dr. Mitchell. "Muscles are weakened, not harmed beyond repair. The body is fighting, but it is exhausted. The fever has depleted what you call ki? Life energy. The channels are blocked." Mitchell frowned. "Mrs. Yamada, I respect your traditions, but medically speaking, this is a viral infection affecting the motor neurons. It's not about blocked channels or life energy. It's about inflammation in the spinal cord and brainstem." "Yes," Akiko agreed, surprising him. "The inflammation. This is what blocks the channels. Your medicine and mine, we see the same thing. We only describe it with different words. You wish to reduce the inflammation, yes? To help the body heal itself. Of course, but we don't have the resources for proper treatment." "I have resources," Akiko said quietly. "Not machines, not medicines from a pharmacy, but I have knowledge that is 2,000 years old, passed from my grandmother to my mother to me. In Japan, before I came to America, I studied with a master of Kampo medicine. When I married and moved to California, I helped many people in our community, until the war came and took everything away." She opened her canvas bag and began removing items, glass jars containing dried herbs, roots and what appeared to be tree bark, small vials of concentrated oils, strips of clean cotton cloth, and a battered notebook filled with handwritten Japanese characters alongside English translations. "I will make a tea," she explained, selecting specific herbs with practiced precision. "It contains willow bark for the fever and pain, licorice root to support the body's defensive systems, ginger to improve circulation, astragalus to strengthen what you call the immune response. But more important than the tea is what comes after. Which is? Mitchell asked, his skepticism beginning to give way to professional curiosity. Movement. Very gentle. Very specific. In your medicine, you keep sick children still, in bed, resting. This is good for some things. For this disease, this is wrong. The muscles must move, or they will forget how to move. The body must be reminded that it is alive, that it can heal, that it is stronger than the sickness. Over the next 3 hours, Akiko demonstrated her technique. The tea, prepared with boiling water and steeped for exactly 20 minutes, was given to Mary Beth in small sips. It smelled of earth and spice, of things growing in distant forests. Then came the massage, Akiko's strong fingers working the weakened muscles, with a combination of gentleness and precision that Mitchell had never witnessed in any physical therapy session. But it was the exercises that truly captured his attention. Akiko would support Mary Beth's leg, moving it through tiny, almost imperceptible ranges of motion, never forcing, always encouraging the child's own muscles to participate. She hummed as she worked, a soft melody that seemed to soothe the girl's fear and pain. "This is shiatsu?" Mitchell asked, recognizing some similarities to techniques he'd read about in medical journals. "Similar," Akiko confirmed, "but adapted. Shiatsu is for many conditions. What I do now is specific for this disease, for these symptoms. I learned it from my grandmother, who survived a similar outbreak in Japan when she was a child. The old masters, they understood that sickness is not just in the body. It is in the spirit too. To heal the body, you must heal the spirit." Sarah Henderson watched from the doorway, her prejudices warring with hope. This woman, this enemy alien who spoke in soft tones and moved with such grace, was touching her daughter with more care than any American doctor had shown in the past 2 weeks. The contradiction was almost too much to bear. By evening, something remarkable had happened. Mary Beth's fever, which had hovered at 40 degrees Celsius for 3 days, had dropped to 38.5 degrees. The blue tinge around her lips had faded. Most remarkably, when Akiko asked her to try moving her toes, the child's right foot responded with a tiny, almost invisible twitch. Dr. Mitchell documented everything in his notebook, his scientific mind struggling to reconcile what he was observing with what he'd been taught in medical school. Viral infections didn't respond to herbal teas. Paralyzed muscles didn't begin recovering within hours of massage therapy. And yet, here was evidence that contradicted his certainties. "I will return tomorrow," Akiko said, packing her canvas bag with the same methodical care she'd shown in unpacking it. "The tea must be given 3 times each day. The exercises must be done 4 times. I will teach you how to prepare the tea, how to do the movements. This is not magic. This is discipline, consistency. The body heals itself, but it needs help, needs encouragement." Thomas Henderson stepped forward, his farmer's face red with emotion. "Mrs. Yamada, we can't pay much. The harvest wasn't good last year, and with Mary Beth's illness—" Akiko held up a hand, stopping him. "In the camp, my husband succumbed to illness because there was not enough medicine, not enough doctors, not enough care. I could do nothing. I watched him suffer, and I could do nothing." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Now I have knowledge, I have skill, and there is a child who needs help. You ask me about payment? The payment is that I am not helpless. The payment is that I can use what I know to help instead of watching another person suffer." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Dr. Mitchell, you have other children with this disease?" 10 more, he confirmed, ranging in age from 4 to 14, all showing varying degrees of paralysis. "Tomorrow I will see them all. We will need more supplies. I will make a list." After she left, Sarah Henderson sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "Tom, what have we done if the neighbors find out we brought a Japanese woman into our home?" "Let them find out," Thomas said firmly. "Our daughter moved her toes, Sarah. For the first time in a week she moved her toes. That woman did in a few hours what all the American doctors couldn't do in 2 weeks. I don't care what anyone says." Over the following days, word spread through the community like wildfire through dry wheat. The Japanese woman was treating the Henderson girl. The Japanese woman had some kind of miracle cure. The Japanese woman was using enemy magic on American children. The reactions ranged from desperate hope to furious condemnation. By the end of the first week, 5 more families had swallowed their pride and their prejudice and brought their children to wherever Akiko was working that day. Dr. Mitchell accompanied her to every house, partly to provide medical oversight, partly to protect her from the hostile stares and occasional verbal abuse that followed her everywhere. The transformation in the children was undeniable. Mary Beth Henderson was sitting up in bed, able to move both legs, her fever completely gone. Timothy Walsh, a 9-year-old who had been unable to move anything below his waist, could now wiggle all 10 toes and was beginning to regain feeling in his legs. Emma Rodriguez, whose paralysis had affected her breathing muscles, no longer needed the manual respirator that her father had been operating for 12 hours a day. Not every child improved so dramatically. 2 of the 11 cases showed only minimal progress, their viral load apparently too severe for even Akiko's methods to overcome. But even these children stabilized, their fevers broke, their breathing eased. All 11 children survived, a statistic that defied the national rates for similar outbreaks. Dr. Mitchell found himself spending hours discussing methodology with Akiko, their conversations becoming a bridge between radically different medical philosophies. She explained the concept of campo medicine, where illness was seen as an imbalance in the body's systems rather than simply an invasion by pathogens. He shared his knowledge of viral mechanics, of how poliovirus attacked motor neurons, of the inflammatory cascade that followed infection. "Your medicine is good for understanding the mechanism," Akiko observed during one of these discussions, her hands never stopping their work as she massaged young Timothy's legs. "My medicine is good for supporting the body's response. Why must they be enemies? Why can they not work together?" It was a question that seemed to echo beyond the medical realm, touching on something deeper and more painful. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Mitchell had been researching Akiko's herbal formula, comparing it against the latest medical journals. What he discovered shocked him. Several of the compounds in her tea had been identified by researchers at Johns Hopkins University as having potential anti-inflammatory and immune-modulating properties. The willow bark contained salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin. The licorice root had glycyrrhizin, which showed promise in reducing inflammation. The astragalus had polysaccharides that appeared to enhance immune function. "Mrs. Yamada," he said one afternoon, his voice carrying a note of wonder, "do you realize what you've created here? This isn't just traditional medicine. This is a systematic therapeutic approach that happens to align with cutting-edge research. The combination of anti-inflammatory compounds, immune support, and aggressive physical therapy. It's exactly what the latest studies are suggesting might help polio patients." Akiko smiled, a rare expression that transformed her sad features. "Dr. Mitchell, this formula is 400 years old. The old masters, they did not have your microscopes or your laboratories, but they had observation. They had patience. They had thousands of years of trying different combinations, recording what worked, what didn't work. You think your modern science has discovered something new, but really, you have only confirmed what the old masters already knew." The tension in the community reached its peak when Reverend Thomas Cooper devoted his Sunday sermon to the topic of the Japanese healer. His small Baptist church was packed that morning, with people standing in the aisles and spilling out onto the steps. His message was unambiguous. Accepting help from the enemy was a betrayal of every American boy who had been lost in the Pacific. The Japanese were treacherous, cruel, and fundamentally alien to American values. Allowing one of them to treat American children was not only foolish, but morally wrong. Thomas Henderson stood up in the middle of the sermon, his face flushed with anger. "Reverend Cooper," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, "my daughter can walk again. Timothy Walsh can move his legs. Emma Rodriguez can breathe on her own. These are facts. These are miracles. And you stand there telling us to reject the person who made them possible because of where she was born?" "Those children would have recovered anyway," the Reverend argued. "The Lord's healing doesn't come through heathen practices and enemy magic." "My daughter couldn't move for 2 weeks," Sarah Henderson added, standing beside her husband. The Reverend's eyes widened in surprise. Sarah had been one of the most vocal opponents of the Japanese in the community. Every doctor we consulted said we should prepare for her to never walk again, maybe never breathe on her own. Mrs. Yamada gave her back her life. I don't care if you call it heathen, I call it a blessing. The church erupted in argument, voices overlapping in anger and confusion. Some sided with the Hendersons. Others supported the Reverend. A few families walked out entirely, unable to reconcile their hatred with their need. Dr. Mitchell stood and waited for the noise to subside. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 2 decades of medical practice. I understand the anger in this room. I understand the pain. I lost friends at Pearl Harbor. My nephew was lost at Iwo Jima. But I took an oath when I became a doctor, an oath to heal the sick regardless of who they are or where they come from. Mrs. Yamada has done more for these children in 2 weeks than everything I tried in the 2 weeks before she arrived. That's not opinion. That's medical fact. And if any of you have children who develop symptoms, you'll have a choice to make: your pride or your child's life. The sermon ended in chaos, but the battle lines had been drawn. Families were forced to choose between community approval and their children's health. For most, it wasn't really a choice at all. By the end of March, all 11 children were showing significant improvement. Mary Beth Henderson took her first unassisted steps on March 28th, exactly 3 weeks after Akiko's first visit. The community gathered at the Henderson farm to witness it, and even those who disapproved of the methods couldn't help but be moved by the sight of the 7-year-old girl walking across her living room, her mother crying tears of joy, her father's face split by a grin so wide it seemed to hurt. Akiko watched from the background as she always did, never seeking credit or recognition. Dr. Mitchell stood beside her, and in that moment he saw her not as a former enemy or an alien presence, but as what she truly was. A healer who had lost everything, yet somehow found the strength to give everything away. "Mrs. Yamada," he said quietly, "I'm going to write a paper about this, about your methods, your formula, the results we've seen. It should be published, shared with other doctors who might encounter similar outbreaks." She shook her head gently. "You may write your paper, doctor, but please do not use my name. I do not need recognition. I only need to be allowed to help when I can help." "Why?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "You've achieved something remarkable. You deserve credit." Akiko was silent for a long moment, watching Mary Beth laugh as she showed her grandmother her walking skills. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "In the camp, they took our names, our homes, our dignity. They gave us numbers instead. I was number 8,427. My husband was number 8,428. When he left this world, they did not even put his name on the grave marker, just his number. I do not need my name on a paper to know who I am. I need only to know that I helped these children. That is enough." Dr. Mitchell did write his paper, though he honored Akiko's request for anonymity, referring to her only as a practitioner of traditional East Asian medicine. The paper was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in July 1946, detailing the treatment protocol and the remarkable recovery rates. It sparked both interest and controversy, with some physicians dismissing it as anecdotal evidence, while others began experimenting with similar approaches. The polio outbreak in western Kansas remained small, contained to those initial 11 cases, with no further spread and all positive outcomes. The children recovered to varying degrees, some completely, others with minor lingering effects, but all alive, all mobile, all breathing on their own. Akiko Yamada continued to work on the Hoffman farm, treated the occasional patient who sought her help, and slowly became, if not fully accepted, at least tolerated in the community. The Hendersons became her strongest advocates, and Thomas Henderson made sure that anyone who spoke ill of her in his presence knew exactly where he stood on the matter. 3 years later, in 1949, when the Salk polio vaccine trials began, Dr. Mitchell sent detailed notes about Akiko's treatment protocol to the research team. While the vaccine would ultimately prove to be the definitive solution to polio, researchers noted with interest how the anti-inflammatory and immune-supporting properties of traditional herbal medicine had helped bridge the gap until modern vaccination became available. The children Akiko treated grew up to become teachers, farmers, mechanics, and nurses. Mary Beth Henderson became a physical therapist, dedicating her career to helping others recover from paralysis and neurological injuries. She often told her patients about the small Japanese woman who had saved her life with nothing but ancient knowledge, strong hands, and a determination to turn her grief into healing. In 1952, President Truman formally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans during the war, calling it a grave injustice. Akiko Yamada lived to see that apology, though she never received individual compensation for what had been taken from her. She passed away peacefully in 1978 at the age of 70, in the small house on the Hoffman farm that had become her home. At her funeral, the church was packed, not just with Japanese Americans from across Kansas, but with the families she had helped, the children she had healed, and the community members who had learned, slowly and painfully, that healing knows no nationality, that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the people we're taught to hate are the ones who save us. Dr. Mitchell, retired by then and in his 80s, gave the eulogy. His hands shook as he held his notes, but his voice was strong. "Akiko Yamada taught me more about medicine than all my years in medical school," he said. "She taught me that healing is not just about understanding the mechanism of disease, but about understanding the totality of the patient, body, mind, and spirit. She taught me that wisdom doesn't belong to any one culture or tradition, that ancient knowledge and modern science can work together if we have the humility to listen. But most importantly, she taught me that the measure of a healer is not in the recognition they receive, but in the lives they touch, the hope they restore, and the love they give even when the world has given them nothing but loss and pain." He paused, looking out at the faces in the pews, former patients, now middle-aged with children of their own, Japanese American families who had endured the same camps and found the same hard-won acceptance, young doctors and nurses who had heard the stories and wanted to pay their respects to a woman whose name never appeared in the medical journals, but whose legacy lived in every patient who benefited from the integration of traditional and modern medicine. "The children she saved are grown now," Mitchell continued. "They have children of their own, and those children will have children." Akiko Yamada's healing didn't stop with the individuals she treated. It rippled forward through generations, through the families that would not exist if those children had suffered worse outcomes, through the community that learned to see past its hatred, through the medical establishment that slowly, grudgingly began to acknowledge that healing wisdom exists in many traditions, not just our own. She asked for no recognition. She received little appreciation in her lifetime, but her legacy is written not in journals or textbooks, but in the living, breathing, walking, running, dancing descendants of the children she saved, with nothing but a crazy tea recipe and hands that refused to give up even when the world had taken everything else from her. The Kansas prairie stretched out beyond the church windows, golden wheat swaying in the summer breeze, the same fields that had witnessed such suffering and such healing, such hatred and such hope. Somewhere in those fields, children ran and played, their lungs strong, their legs steady, their lives possible because one woman had refused to let her grief define her, choosing instead to transform it into healing. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.